So I'm going to talk about drawboring, and if you've got questions, just shout them out, and there's no stupid question. And I don't know everything, so if you've got a better idea, feel free to bring it up as well. So drawboring is a method used in conjunction with a mortise and tenon joint. So let's start there. What's a mortise and tenon joint? So a mortise and tenon joint is basically a recess of a specific size and a protrusion of a specific size that fit together. Okay, so they can be any shape, right? It can be rectangular, it can be square, it can be round, as you would see in a chair. It can be fixed, meaning that the protrusion is fixed on one end. It can also be floating. So some of you are probably familiar with the domino joint, right? That's basically a floating mortise and tenon. Okay, you can do the same thing without a domino machine. You just router, make your mortise, make a round stick. It can be a rectangular stick. You can make a floating mortise and tenon that's rectangular, just like this, right? And there's different applications for that. A lot of them have to do with assembly. Some of it has to do with efficiency, to where you don't, or material usage. Yeah. Right. Yep. Is that the one that's like dowels stacked together? Yeah. 5 dowels. Yep. Right. Yep. Same concept. So you've got square, you've got round, you've got floating. You could have they could be oval. So the mortise and tenon is simply that protrusion sticking in to hold your two pieces, join your two pieces together, right? So as far as a mortise and tenon goes, how do they actually fasten, right? So we're trying to create surface area for these to interlock. Okay, so there's different ways that they can fasten. They can fasten with glue, which everybody just kind of assumes that you're going to put glue on. They can fasten with a wedge, right? So where you have expansion, so the wedge is expanding the tenon inside. That trestle table, the back there, is a rectangular mortise and tenon on the trestle that's wedged at the end, right? So same concept. You're basically expanding the protrusion inside of the recess, okay? You can have a peg or a pin, which is whatever you want to, it could be square, it could be round, right? But you're basically a piece of material that is intersecting the two to hold them in place, okay? So those are all methods to actually hold the mortise and tenon joint. Now, what's drawboring? Okay, so drawboring is actually holding these two pieces in place under constant tension with a pin. Okay, so that's the whole premise. Okay, and there's lots of theorizing as to why. And people will say things like, well, hundreds of years ago they didn't have clamps, so they had to come up with a way to be able to hold it together. Well, they had rope and they tied things together with rope, right? So but in general, this pin is under tension like a spring, and it's actually pulling these two pieces of wood together tight under tension all the time. And as these are expanding and contracting, they're actually increasing tension, right? So the tension is just increasing, slightly decreasing based on the moisture content of the wood. So all we're going to look at right now is how do we do that practically and functionally. And we can do that with any mortise and tenon joint. You can do that in a round mortise and tenon joint. I almost made a mock-up just so we could do that. You can do it in a floating mortise and tenon joint. You just have to do both sides, okay? And you can do it in a square mortise and tenon joint, okay? This is the most common. You'll often see it done in furniture built before 1820. Yeah. Ah. It was drawboard. There you go. So we're talking very, very old. That's all we can say. This is an example that Jeff Lefkowitz brought that is an example made by Peter Follansbee. So this is, and those of you that don't know who Peter Follinsby is. He was the head of the Plymouth Plantation wood shop for years, and he's an authority on 16th century furniture making. So he actually made this. We're going to make one of these, and then we're also going to make a second one and saw it in half on the bandsaw so we can actually see what is going on. Yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Very tight. Yeah. All right. So first so we covered all that. So everybody on the same page. All right. We're not talking about how to cut mortise and tenons. We're not talking about types of mortise and tenons. We're talking about the mechanical holding together of a mortise and tenon. Okay. It's basically, think of it as an alternative to glue. It can be used in conjunction with glue, but we're going to pretend that it's an alternative to glue. So first, let's say we've already cut our mortise and tenons, and I've got a couple here. This one's really sloppy, right? So we're going to do two. This one's very sloppy. Okay. If this was mine, I would glue something on the cheek and plane it back down and get that sucker tight before I ever use it. Okay. Super sloppy. Okay. This one's comfortable. Okay. Not a little bit of wiggle room, but very acceptable. Okay. And this one is floating. All right. So what is draw boring? So draw boring is when we take a pin or peg, whatever term you want to use, and typically if we just pinned this without draw boring, we would put this joint together, drill a hole, drive the pin in. Okay. Now wood moves. There's wood that has moved and wood that hasn't. So this is going to expand and contract. Well, this pin is the same size as the hole, right? If you drilled a hole smaller than the pin, you got a little bit of tolerance there, but let's say it was much smaller, you would split the joint. And if it was much bigger, it would fall right through. And if it's the same size, as that wood expands and contracts, it can still work its way out. And I can attest to that in having made furniture that way, and it sits in the sun and things expand and contract and get hot, and next thing you know, you can catch your fingernail on the tips of those pins because they're kind of working their way around. Okay, so at that point, yes, you have a mechanical intersecting piece of wood that's keeping this from coming out, but you're really relying on the glue to hold it all together. Okay, so now let's pretend take glue totally out of the equation. We're not using glue. How do we get this pin through here to hold this tight, even under expansion and contraction? And so basically what we do is we're going to be drilling a hole in this tenon in a different place than the cheek, so that when we drive the pin in, it's actually pulling it tight. Okay. So first is layout. Let's say this is our actual joint that we're working with. Okay. So first question that I always ask doing it is like, so what size? How big? Where do I put it? And there's lots of people that, you know, throw rules of thumbs out there. I don't think any of them are applicable in every application. So you just have to use your good old common sense when it comes down to it. Personally, I like to have my drawbore pin intersect right about dead center of the tenon. Okay. And so when we're driving this in, this pin or peg is going to put an incredible amount of force on this tenon, pulling it into the mortise. Okay. So if we get too close to this edge, we'll just blow out the back of this tenon, and it'll just blow it right out. And if we get too close to the shoulder, then when we're in the cheek side, we run the risk of all the pressure splitting off the front of this cheek. Okay. So depending on your mortise and tenon and how your proportions are, you may want to shift it further back. You may want to shift it further forward, but you're going to want to make sure that you're leaving enough meat on the cheek and you're leaving enough meat at the back side of the tenon. One thing to think about is the thickness of the cheek here. So like this cheek is very thick, right? I could get this pretty close to that edge without splitting that cheek off, right? Because I'm over ½ an inch there, right there in the cheek thickness. So that's something to consider. But what that also means is that I'm pretty thin on this tenon, right? So I need plenty of strength in this tenon because this is only right at a half an inch. So this pin really only needs to push a little half inch by half inch, 5/16 by half inch little piece out, right? So we need to make sure we have plenty there. So for this application, I'm going to go ahead and set it at dead center. And so I'm just going to mark a line. And I'm doing this. You don't have to mark a line on the tenon. I'm going to do this just for visual so we know where we're at. Okay. So when we put this in, our pin's going to fall right in here. Okay. So we'll mark. First thing we'll do is we'll mark this line. Then we got to decide, well, how many pins, right? Do we need one? Do we need two? This could easily take two, especially in a table stretcher. Okay. For this example, we're only going to do one. Okay. So I'm just going to put a mark dead center of the active mortise. Yep. We're actually going to talk about that next. Okay. So there's the center of our drawbore pin. Okay. Now, the next thing is how big of a pin. Okay. So with this being held under tension, what's actually going to happen is the pin is going to come through the cheek. It's going to be bent and forced to go into the hole in the tenon and then curve back. So when it's done, it's going to be bowed pretty strongly. Okay. So one thing to think about is how much force is it going to take to bend that pin through that joint, right? And not compromise the integrity of these cheeks, right? So that's where it comes into thickness. I don't personally have any rule of thumb to give you. I typically just work in eighth-inch increments. Most of the mortise and tenon joints that you would use in like a table to leg apron size, you're going to be somewhere around 5/16 to half an inch, okay, in that range. Much smaller and it's too small, you're just going to break your pin off because it doesn't have the strength to pull it tight. If you get down to drawboring, let's say cabinet face frames, or let's say a frame and panel case construction for, let's say, a bookcase, and it's a raised panel end, so you're dealing with 3/4 inch thick material with little 1/4 inch tenons. 1/4 inch is plenty big or thick. So for this example, I'm going to go ahead and use a 5/16 just for the sake of the example. So now we have it marked, okay? And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to drill the hole all the way through the cheek. We don't need the tenon at all, okay? So let's say we're putting a door together like this door over here. You got your rails, your stiles. You're going to dry fit the whole damn thing. Put it all together, clamp it up, okay? So it's exactly where you want it. Sorry, no, back up. First, you're going to drill all these. You're going to mark and drill every single one of these holes, okay? We're just going to go ahead and drill this. All right, so we laid them all out. We drilled them all. Now we're going to dry fit everything. All right, so now we're going to dry fit the whole thing, okay? Door, all the rails and stiles, all the joinery goes together, all the mortise and tenons are tight, clamp it in place. You're going to check for square. Everything is as it's going to be when it's done, okay? Then we're going to mark the center of this hole onto the tenon. So we're going to transfer that mark. The easiest way to do it is take the same drill bit, it's a brad point bit, and just drop it in the hole. I'll give it a little tap, okay? If you've got a whole bunch of them to do, you can use the scratch awl. One thing that I often use is these little spring-loaded hole punches, just because they're super fast. If you've got 50 little things to do, you can just come along and go pop, and you got a hole, and you just keep running around. Sometimes a scratch awl, you're sitting there wiggling, trying to make sure that you got your mark made. So these are like $8. You don't need it at all. You can use a nail, but they're handy if you've got a lot of repetition. So now we marked the center of this hole. So if we just went ahead and drilled that on center, it's going to be no different than if we just pinned it, right? Because they're both aligned. All right. So now what we're going to do, and this is where everybody screws up. what we want to do is we want to offset the hole in the tenon so that the peg is forced to pull the tenon tight. Okay, so all you have to remember is that you always move the hole closer to the shoulder. Okay, it's always closer to the shoulder. Now, you asked about peg diameter. The larger the joint gets, the less you can offset. And it's for the same reason. How much can you flex this pin? Okay, that workbench over there has 5/8 diameter pins that are drawboard. Okay, so you can only flex a 5/8 diameter pin so hard. When you do timber frames, like I've done very large timber frame trusses that go together, and you've got 1-inch pins or 1.25-inch pins, and you're drawboring them, you can barely offset them, right? Because they're huge, right? So think about those types of things when you go to offset. Most furniture construction, 1/8 of an inch is a pretty decent offset. You're going to get quite a bit of tension pulled onto it. You don't have to offset a ton. A 1/16 is enough, but much less than a 1/16, and you're going to kind of feel like, oh, did that kind of do anything? Okay, so there's kind of a fine line. I use the same as the rest of the joint. Okay, there's a couple reasons for that. Number one reason is with the expansion and contraction, they're going to move around at the same rate. You can easily use something else. Honestly, the expansion and contraction there is so minimal, you're not going to notice a lot. But if you use a really closed pore dense hardwood, especially an exotic, like let's say you took something like ebony and you did an ebony peg, you got a couple problems. Number one is, does it have the tensile strength or elasticity to take the bend? And then number two, it's not going to expand and contract at all. And then you've got a softwood that's going to expand and contract. So seasonally, you're going to see that peg kind of stick up. But that's not from the peg moving. That's from the cheek face, right? So the cheek face is going to shrink. So those are some things to think about. You can definitely use something stronger. If I had something I was super concerned about the pins breaking, which does happen, you could use something like a hickory or a white oak, right? There you go, right? Yep. Yes. All right, and the reason being is you go to drive these pins home, and if it breaks off, you're screwed. There's no way to get it out. You're not getting it out. You're just drilling it out and putting a pin in it, hoping the glue holds. Yeah, your pin. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. So personally, no, because there's not much room in there for that pin to move, right? The pin. Yeah, we'll get to that. So we've drilled this hole and we've marked the tenon. Okay, back to offset. Which way do we move the drill bit? Towards the shoulder, right? Towards the shoulder, towards the shoulder, towards the shoulder. It's kind of like cutting dovetails. Cut the wrong one out. So the same thing happens. You drill the wrong side, you offset the wrong side, and then you're hoop, and you glue it and put a pin in it. Hope for the best. All right, so this one I'm going to offset about 1/8 of an inch. I don't measure it. You just eyeball it and call it good, and go ahead and drill that hole out. Okay, thank you. So when we put these together now, can you see the light through there? Okay, see it's a crescent half moon. It's not round, right? So now when I drive the pin in, it's going to bring those two holes into alignment. And when it brings those two into alignment, you want it pulling the joint tight, not pushing it apart, right? So if we went the other way, if I offset towards the end of the tenon and I drove the pin in, it's going to gap and stop just like that. Yep. It'll go right in, right? No problem at all. All right. So that's why, right? And that's I just put a very heavy offset in there, so we're going to get to feel what this actually feels like. I'm going to let somebody else count it home. So now we're ready to actually pin it. Okay. So that's ready. I'm gonna go ahead and drill this one out real quick so we have both of them. Is there any other questions while we're talking about this? Yes. Now, is there another option? Yes. You could use dowel rods, but the grain has to be 100% dead straight. Just as dead straight as absolutely possible. Yeah, we're going to do that right now. Yeah. You could use a dowel rod. I personally have tried, people talk about, who is it? I was reading reading Chris Swarz's stick chair book the other day, and he talks about picking out dowel rods in the hardware store. I was like, God, man, I'd have to go to every hardware store with 3 hours to find it. Yeah. I don't live in an urban metropolis. Like, I don't know about you, but my local hardware store does not replenish their dowel rods every 2 weeks. Like, that would take forever. So you can find dowel rods that are straight enough. It's not very common, and the reason why is doweling molders that the dowel rods get shoved through. They're just ripping off squares and they're just feeding them through. So it's however it comes out of the board. It's not a priority to make sure that the grain is straight. No, I did that simply because these were just scraps. I was doing another project a couple weeks ago, and I knew I had this demo, and I just buzzed some scraps out, and the cheeks aren't the same thickness, so I was just making sure. Yep. Correct. And so there's a difference between tight this way and tight back and forth. Okay. And so Peter Follensby's tenon here, his tenon itself is thin compared to the mortise. So it has play in it going front to back. So when Jeff brought it tonight, it was not flush on the front. Okay. And so I just took a clamp and squeezed it flush, right? But it's tight this way, and you're not moving it or moving it around at all, right? So the drawbore will pull a loose tenon tight, okay, but it can still be misaligned, right? You can still cut your tenon crooked, cockeyed, and your face does not line up, okay? Now, yeah, when you shove the panel in the groove, then it would pull tight. Yes, all the way through. Yeah. Okay, so like this one right here is pretty sloppy, right? Like I've got a heavy 1/8 inch, right? That's a lot of slop. Okay, and I did this one like this on purpose so that we can see how it pulls it tight, right? So I can pull it tight this way with the drawbore, tight. It's not going to move, right? But let's say I whack a 1/4 inch off this tenon in thickness this way, right? With one pin, it could still cock like this or like this. Okay? It's going to be under tension, so it's not going to happen easily, but it can still happen. Now, if you drawbore 2 pins in there, it's not going anywhere, even if the tenon was too small this direction. Okay? Now this direction, right? So this is way too thin and it's sloppy. Okay? It doesn't matter how many drawbore pins you put in there, right? You could knock it out of alignment this way or this way. Okay? Now, most furniture and pieces of construction, that's not where your force is. Okay? Even a table leg at a corner, right? Let's say you have a table leg at the corner and you've got another one coming in this direction. Your strength is vertical, up and down, and from the corner with somebody hitting the leg, right? So you don't have forces coming on the side, right? And that's why all engineering and construction, you're hitting spine, so height for weight comes down, right? So very few instances would this matter. Where it would matter, a cabinet door, a frame cabinet door with a panel in it, and it's on hinges, and it's getting slammed all the time. And this vertical is your vertical style going up. It goes top to bottom, right? And it's getting slammed. it's going to eventually misalign. Okay, because it has a lot of force on that face, but it'll stay tight. But the face is tight. Well, that's going to this way. It's going to misalign regardless of how many pins you have. Yeah, and really what it comes down to is still cut your mortise and tenon tight. Just go ahead and cut them tight. Yep. Blanket shot. Okay, there you go. Yeah. 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 And the larger the tenon is, the sloppier it can be. So in theory, the larger the tenon is, the sloppier it can be, because the larger it is, the more force it takes to put together, period. Right? So your tolerance, if we were doing mortise and tenon on a 6x6 beams to put a timber frame truss together, right? If you had an 1/8 inch of slop and we go to put that together, it's going to feel pretty tight going together, right? Because it's so hard to get that perfect consistency all four squared all the way. And you have more strength. It's larger. A lot of those beautiful, you see Instagram pictures of these big, beautiful timber frame joints that just look perfect. If you've ever been on site and you're watching the video, they're a lot sloppier than they look like in the picture. Even the perfect one. Yeah. The square area of the joint in general. I personally have never seen a need for that. To make it well, I could see, because they're doing this style of work, like wooden hand planes, splitting it out of a log, etc. Let me think through that a second. Where that application plays. So when you chop dovetails and you're chopping out pins with a chisel, say you did not cut your waste out with a coping saw at all, you chop the center and then you flip it over and you chop the center, right? If you're going to be off with your plumb of your chisel at all, you want to be off out so that the tip is forward, so that when the joint actually goes together, the discrepancy is inside and the face is still flush. So really what they're doing there is they're taking away meat on the back to make sure that when they pull this tight that there's no gap. Personally, I would just see that as inferior work, because you just weakened the back side. So now, in theory, strength this way, you could flex that joint because now you have a gap from shoulder to rail. Right. Yeah. So if your tolerances, yes, exactly. So the tolerances of work are very different, and so then it could be applicable. Yeah. Honestly, if you're working with those types of antique tools, cutting shoulders by hand on the top of a workbench, like very few people saw accurately enough to make every tenon sheet perfect. And so normally you're sawing the line and chiseling. But anyway, all right. So we've got these two ready to pin. So now let's talk about pins. So we talked about the amount of strength or the amount of tension that this pin needs to go under. And this pin right here would not be suitable for drawboring, right? You probably can't see, but the grain starts down here and runs out about right here. Okay. So we need the grain to run perfectly true end to end. So if the grain's in the center over here, it needs to be in the center over here. Now, what's to our advantage is that these pins need to be very short. Okay. So they only need to be a little bit longer than the material is thick. Okay. So word of caution, do not make big long pins and drive them in if you feel like you need something to grab. Okay. You will just break that pin off and drive it through your hand like a nail. Okay. So the shorter the pin is this way, the stouter it is, right? When you're driving it in, it's breaking off, right? A long pin like this, you got a lot of leverage. So if you're trying to pound this in, you got a lot of leverage to just pop that puppy off. Okay. So what I recommend is cut your pin stock a little bit longer than the thickness of everything, okay? And you'll see later, or you'll see in a little bit why you want to be longer and not perfect. In theory, you could just make it exactly or pretty much exactly and be fine. But we're also going to taper the fronts of these pins, and these pins are also going to come out the backside pretty cattywampus, so you want some extra meat there to be able to play with. So I would normally shoot for 3/4 inch, something like that extra, just so that you have some extra meat to play with, but no more than you need, okay? Yeah, to get it started in the hole. I should have found a piece. One thing to look at is you need to watch the face of the board and the edge of the board. All right, so a typical plain sawn board, when you look at the end grain, the grain's running in an arch, okay? So that means that the outside edge is going to be quarter sawn or rift sawn grain. Center is going to be plain sawn. So this one, you have half the cathedral, right? When you look at a wide board, I don't keep scraps in the shop for a good reason, but let's say your cathedrals are running at an angle like this, okay? The grain is going to be crooked even if it looks straight on this edge, okay? Because it's crooked on the opposite plane when we rip perpendicularly. So when you're looking at a piece and you're looking at these cathedrals like it exists right here, you want to make sure that that cathedral is running parallel with the edge of the board. And when you look at this edge, that the grain is running parallel with the faces. Okay, so you got to check both faces. Now, once you cut it off, it's probably going to be perfectly straight both ways anyway. Okay, sawn or split, because we're working with such a short block. Okay. Now, different species are different. Some they can look straight and they're not. But some are brash, like you're working in cherry or walnut, diffuse porous wood. Like they can be brash, which means they break off across the grain this way very easily. So keeping some of those things in mind is important. Now, the surest way to make sure that you have straight grain is to actually split your pins out. Okay, you can do this just big chisel. Now, how big are we going to make our pins? The size of our drill bit. So we've got 5/16, right? By 5/16. So splitting them out is a very clean, easy way. You can use a chisel. There's a knife called a hacking knife, which is basically just like this little mini shop cleaver that's used for doing this. If you were to do any work with Peter Kolensky, this is the only way to do it. I didn't split straight, and that way we know which ones are straight, which ones are not. So this grain's running a little crooked. Just this way. Now, this is easy. Anybody with a chisel can do it. It's also kind of wasteful. The wood boiler. So you could carve this. I really didn't get any beautiful points, but Peter was telling me that pretty raggedy. Yeah. So you could just take a knife and you can just carve the pin, right? Carve it round so you're about the right size. Okay, that's how easy it is. Just carve it. Or there's also this tool called a dowel plate. Okay. This is basically a machine steel plate with holes drilled in it in a step pattern. This face is flattened like this so that this inside edge is sharp, and then you just drive drive the wood through it. This is what I use just so that I have a nice concentric pin. And you know, I'm at 5/16, so you'll start, you know, you have to start a little bit bigger. So I'll pop this through the 3/8. If I was doing a bunch of work, I'd set this up more properly, but right now we have a pin that's mostly round, very straight grain, out of the same material this is, and it's the right diameter. Okay. Second way to do it is to go over to the bandsaw. We'll do that. And we're just going to rip out little 5/16 pieces. And because I used a piece that I'd already made sure that the grain was straight, I can get a much more symmetrical pin. Now, why a symmetrical pin? That's going to be all aesthetics, because when we drive it through the hole, if it's not perfectly round, it's going to look like this on the side, right? It's not going to fully fill that sphere. Now, I would normally then just take these and run them through the dowel plate again. On the dowel plate, you don't have to spend $100 on the dowel plate. When I was in middle school, I made my own dowel plate. I just took a piece of thick steel and took a drill bit, drilled a bunch of holes the size that I want, and then literally just took a hammer and smacked that face of the hole to create a burr and used it for a long time. And if it got dull, then I just took it to a sharpening stone and I kind of ran it around and beat burr back on it, went to town. Or you can spend $125 and buy one that's machined. Another tip, if you're doing a lot of pins, is you can chuck your pins in the drill. Okay, and it makes it much, much faster. So you can actually just do this. Like tapered enough. Right, so now I've got a nearly perfect pin. Okay. Finish making this round. We'll make one more, and then we'll go ahead and put these suckers together. Bring Now, one thing you might be thinking, asking, so what about glue? And what about clamps? So there's also a tool that you'll see, and it's old as the hills, as old as drawboring is. They're called a drawbore pin. It's a metal rod, basically, that's tapered. Basically, think of a screwdriver shaft on a handle that's tapered. So down at the tip, it's, you know, it might be 1/4 inch, and up the fat end, it might be 1/2 inch or 3/8. And really all that is it's an alignment pin. If any of you ever worked in industrial construction where you're putting steel I-beams together, they've got the big adjustable wrenches that the handle is tapered down to nothing in the back. Maybe you've seen one of those before. All it is an alignment tool. So you got 2 I-beams, they weigh thousands of pounds, and they're within, the holes are overlapping like that. And you grab the end of that wrench, shove it in the hole, and lever it back and forth until you drop the bolt in, right? So it's same kind of concept. The drawbore pin is basically just an alignment tool. So let's say you're putting together a complex piece of case construction and you got a handful of these drawbore pins. You can put the joints together and just shove that pin in there to kind of hold it in place while you get everything situated and squared up. If your joints all align properly and you have the benefit of having some clamps, then you don't really need a drawbore pin. If you have drawbore pins, you don't necessarily need clamping. So it's just, that's what that's for. Really big joints like timber frame joints, or if you were building a workbench, it's a lot more, they would be a lot more handy than, say, put table legs together. All right, so we've got our pins. We've bored offset. The next thing you need to do is you need to taper the end of the pin, okay? If you're doing a lot of pins, a little pencil sharpener or even a mechanical pencil sharpener does wonders. Or you can just take a knife and just taper the end a little bit. And that's why we have to leave it a little long, right? Because we're going to drive it through till that taper is gone. If you look at Peter's example here, the pins, like the pins are, there's the tip of the taper, right? So we want to avoid that cosmetically, so we can make the pin a little bit extra long. Now, if we were to not taper them, it wouldn't go together because it's going to hit that shelf, not guide itself in. The more offset you have, the more taper, the steeper taper you should have. I put together some big ash and oak pieces where I've had a good 3/4 inch long gradual taper kind of guided it. You don't want something delicate or weak, but you want something enough that it can guide it into this bend delicately without just causing it to wind up. Now we're going to do these without glue. If I was doing this in my own shop, I would go ahead and glue it. Why not? It's going to hold even stronger. The one thing you never want to glue is this. Okay, so you can glue the joint, but do not glue the pin, and this is why. All glue, hide glue, yellow glue, binds up with friction. Right, so you've probably heard of a friction joint. You can take 2 pieces of wood, put a dab of wood glue, and just go like this till it stops. Right, it's a friction joint. Just the heat friction of it causes the glue to bind up and it's done. If you glue these pins, you will get them like 2/3 of the way in, and they will stop and they'll just break off. If you're doing really large joints like that workbench over there or timber framing, then you would actually wax these pins with wax so that to help you get them through. Especially if you've got a really big diameter pin, like 1 inch or 5/8, you're not going to get it through dry. It's just not going to happen. There's too much friction and you're trying to put it in too much of the bed. So we can glue the joint, but don't glue the pin. The other thing to think about during assembly is this pin's going to come back through the back side. So you can't do it flat to bend. Okay? You're going to have some space. So it can get a little convoluted if you've got a really big case piece that you're trying to do. Is just work one joint at a time and work my way around. If all of your joinery is perfectly square and perfectly tight, then by the time you get to the end, you'll be square. Okay, if you've got slop, you can be out of square. Some people will talk about like if you're putting a big, let's say the frame underneath that workbench over there where you've got an apron going all the way around. What you can do is you can start one pin on the one corner and you get that tight, and then you go to the opposite corner. You know, people talk about like alternating corners to try to keep everything square as you go, and you get a really large piece that becomes more of an issue. But your joinery state, for the most part, it's not going to pull out of square. Pulling it back into square, if it is out of square after you put it together, normally long clamps across corners, you can pressure things back into square, and these pins are going to hold it. So we're tapered, this is done, and then it's just driving home. So we're just going to drop that in there. Now, once you start driving it in, you're creating a lot of friction. So if you stop in the middle, the wood's going to move. So just keep it going. Now watch underneath, and see it came right out the back side. Now, if you look out the back side, it's not straight. And that means that we did it right. Because that pin is pulling the joint tight. Right? No clamp, no glue, just that pin holding it together. And that's the sloppy one thing. Yeah. Now, let's say this was a leg to apron joint, and I was building a table, and I build tables like this all the time. I would glue it, I'll go ahead and clamp it up, and then I'll drive all my drawbores home, and I'll pop the clamps off. Right? Clamps are simply take the place of the drawbore pins. It's holding it all in place so my glue doesn't leak, so it stays square. And then I can pop those clamps off, trim the pins, and start sanding. That's how strong it is. You don't have to. Yeah. If I was building a dining room table, big legs, if I had two pins like that, drawboard like that, I'd pop the clamps off so I'm flush and have guys start to sand it while we're doing something else. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So if you're tight, if you're perfectly tight, you could, in theory, it could bottom out. Personally, as a work practice, I never bottom them out. I always leave space, and a couple reasons. One is inevitably when you're putting joints together in a glue joint, you got dust and little tiny shavings and a little bit too much glue, and it'll all fill up in that space. Whereas if you bottoms out perfectly and you get this tiniest little wood shaving, then you can't get the joint tight. I don't know. Yeah, yeah. Yes, you can. Yeah, I've put more tenons together where you couldn't clamp them tight because the glue had nowhere to go. Which in this case, in this case, we've already drilled a hole, right? So it could potentially, but if your cheek's tight, it's not going to come up around there. Yeah. So personally, I always leave like a 3/16 extra, and oftentimes, like this one's there's probably a good 3/8 down there, but I didn't pay that much attention when I did these. Does somebody else want to drive this one? Don't be shy. Come on, Glenn. This is the tight joint, and it's offset. Bail on it. All right. My grain was straight. All right, we'll make another pin real quick, and we'll do it again. So we're lucky that he wasn't like a third of the way through. I did. they'll hit the first two taps. There we go. You can actually see how it deforms the head. I had that offset so hard it actually squished that pin flat in order to get it through, but it still came through. All right, so now we're going to take one and cut it apart on the bandsaw. This one's a little smaller, and then we'll see how it actually works. Go ahead. All right, somebody help me out here. We cut it this way. Yeah, I want to cut it this way. Actually, all right. There we can actually see how the pin bent go through the joint, right? And no more than 1/8 of an inch, right? But we can also see some things that we talked about that were important. So the meat that we leave on the end of this tenon is important, right? And the meat that we leave here on the cheek, super important, right? Because of all the stress that it's putting under. You can also see how much of a gap there is right there underneath the pin. So it actually shoved the grain of this tenon, compressed it, right? And so that's why it's under tension, right? Because now we have compression on this tenon, right? That's pushing down on the pin. And when it's pushing down on the pin's pushing up on the end and actually pulling the whole body of the tenon pipe. So that's the drawbore one. Yeah. Yeah, it's a little more cumbersome because it's trying to shave the corners off. In theory, I guess you could cut a square hole and then offset a square hole. That might be a little. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. On the corners, yeah, you do it. You cut that. Oh yeah. I've done it. If you can do it in a round joint like the chair. Very easy. Yep. So, I mean, this obviously would not work application-wise because you have so much length here to ever get a pin here. But let's say you had a leg projector joint. Not on a chair. I don't. Oh yeah, so leave it proud. That chair, that gentleman's chair, bring that over here, Brad. That one's done that way. Like these are square, but they're round pins. But then the tops of them are left square. We could also do the same thing on this, right? Who is it? Some woodwork. Chris Schwartz maybe. Somebody does that with dominoes with barbecue skewers. They use barbecue skewers as their pins. Does that Schwartz do that? Okay, yeah, I knew it was somebody like that that basically does dominoes like this, and then they'll just take a barbecue skewer, drill a little hole, and drive the barbecue skewer in. Is that necessary? We won't go into that, but it can be done. Now, I will say, yeah. But not see it on the front. Yeah, we used to the cabinet shop that I worked at in high school. We actually did mortise and tenon frames, square mortise and tenon. We cut them on these industrial machines, but true square mortise and tenon face frames like this, and then we pinned them like this from the back and left an 1/8 inch, I think, on the front, so you wouldn't see them on the front, but they were all pegged on the back. Now those are not drawboard. That's just pinned. Just pinned it. Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, because you don't have much or surface area, especially for glue. Any questions? Correct. Well, for drawbore one half and then drawbore the other half. Yep. In this application, your floating tenon would have to bottom out on at least one half. Right. Oh, grain. Oh, orientation in the pin. No, because when you're in the round, in theory, technically, the bend is happening this way. So if you rotated it 90 degrees, it would be on edge, so it would be stronger. Yes. To be honest, when I'm putting a big piece together, I just drive them in and they're good. Yes. You could, yeah. And then it would pull that other pin tight. As long as what we said before, as long as you're not bottoming out. So let's say you were actually going to do it with dominoes, you would have to set your domino to like 28 millimeter and use a 50 millimeter domino so that you had room on either side to play with. Yeah. Does anybody here do floating tenons with a belly mortiser side? No. It's actually super popular in the 70s. Still a lot of people do it. So it's basically a motor with a milling machine or router bit set horizontally and a sliding table. So you're making mortises like this, and then yeah, there you go. Yep. Yeah, Suitors did it all over the place. Oh, really? Oh, wow. Yeah, Suitors did it on a lot of their stuff. It's fast. It's super fast. It's easy to set up. And you can make the floating tenons in bulk. So the floating tenons, you can rip out long lengths on the table saw to the right size, run them through the shaper or the router keyboard around the corner, and then just the length. Yeah, yeah. All right, that's all I got.